Okay, so welcome everybody. Hope you're having a wonderful Monday here in our trek through Jewish history. And so just as we do every week, a little bit of a summary, and then we will continue off. We are officially entering into modernity this week. So we are starting off really in the mid to late 1700s. And so today we're going to talk mostly about the second half of the 1700s and the entirety of the 1800s in the Jewish world. And just like a lot of classes, one of the things that I always try to tell students in my UCI class is you should always be attuned to, especially whenever somebody's covering major chunks of history, but really this probably goes for any type of class that anybody takes. You should always be very attuned to what material is covered and what material is not left out. And you can actually tell a lot about any type of class by what materials and events and things like that are not talked about. Not that there's anything that I'm specifically trying to hide, but obviously when we're covering these major chunks of history, multi-hundred years in 1 week, there's obviously going to be a lot of things that I am making a mostly subjective decision to decide, oh, this thing isn't as important and this other thing is more important. And so it's really interesting just peeling back the curtains to really the study of history in general, of what aspects are important when and why. Obviously, in the field of Jewish studies, this is why I'm starting with this, there's been a lot of scholarship, and not just Jewish studies, really a lot of ethnic studies over the past generation or two, of the fact that when we tell a story of modern day Judaism, our story tends to be very Ashkenazi centric. And this is a pitfall that I am fully going to fall into today during class, because it's very hard to talk about the 17 and 1800s without making this sound like everything was happening in Europe. But one of the things that I've tried very hard to do over the course of these, I think this is the 14th week, and I'm sure people can judge me and give me a grade later, is try to show different cultures and ethnic groups of Judaism in really different geographical regions. And so a lot of the story that I've been trying to tell, and a lot of the way that I've been trying to conceptualize the history, is through different geographical centers. So of course, we started off in Jerusalem, we went to Babylonia, we ended up in Spain for a bit, we ended up in Eastern Europe. And so today, our geographical center of the Jewish world, and by geographical center, I mean the part of the Jewish world that, of course, exerted the most influence on the rest of the Jewish world and how we conceptualize of Judaism today, is Western Europe, mostly Germany, in the 17 and 1800s. And a lot of what we take for granted today in the Jewish community, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited for today is because the history of the Enlightenment, or in Hebrew, the Haskalah, which sort of is basically the same thing as the Enlightenment, but it is usually dubbed the Jewish Enlightenment, directly leads to the Jewish sociology that we see today. And probably next time or the time after, I haven't exactly decided when to cover Zionism, if that should be next week or the week after, because two things basically happen simultaneously at the end of the 1800s, which is the beginning of the Zionist movement, where you see a lot of Jews obviously moving to then Ottoman Empire, eventually British Mandate Palestine, eventually Israel. And at the same time, a lot of European Jews moving to America, where in 1881, you had a massive migration to America. But right now we are still, of course, in Europe. And let me share my screen here. So give me 1 second to do that. Perfect. Okay. So this is the slide that we ended off with last time. And last time we covered Europe, and we talked about a lot of different tensions in the Jewish community, obviously a lot of budding anti-Semitism that was going on there, a lot of different Jewish cultural centers. And at the last time, we sort of left off at a cliffhanger, especially because we skipped last week, where I showed this graphic for a couple of seconds. And this graphic is the Jewish population boom in Europe over the centuries. And so if you look at the bottom, between the 1700s and 1900, population goes up from about 1 million to 10 million. And so the Jewish population increases about tenfold. I mentioned last time, and I think this is just important to say, that this isn't a uniquely Jewish phenomenon. If you look at other population graphics and statistics from Europe at this time, the rest of the population follows a similar trajectory. And right, there's a lot of history here about why the population grew so rapidly in Europe during this time. But this becomes the main Jewish center. And again, for anybody who wants to pick this out with a fine comb, you can obviously see the different countries and where different groups of people were. And we'll see that the majority of Jews at this time actually lived in Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, countries that are not considered Western Europe. And so I want to start there, which is where the bulk of Jews were living during this time. But as we'll soon see, the major cultural influence that happened in the Jewish world actually happened in Western Europe. And so I decided to stick with the slideshow as opposed to a source sheet, because there were a lot of different historical eras and geographical places that I wanted to travel to. And so we can see how this works. So our first stop today is going to be in all these countries that I just listed. And this is where we get the famous or infamous Pale of Settlements. And I was actually considering, I think everybody here probably saw the news, that the Israeli actor who played Tevye in The Fiddler on the Roof passed away late last week. And if we think Fiddler on the Roof, right, that famous song tradition, which is all about, of course, a shtetl in Eastern Europe that is starting to have the next generation slowly break off from Jewish traditional norms because of new Enlightenment information coming in, right? This is exactly the time period of the Pale of Settlement. And so the Pale of Settlement lasted for about 120 years, from 1791 to 1917. This is when we get the shtetl life. And so Jews in the Pale of Settlement, which encompassed this massive geographical area, they were confined to specific areas, right? They also, there's always a interesting historical debate. The answer is probably both sides are right, which is when Jews lived in shtetls in Eastern Europe in the 1800s, was that because the rest of the public forced them into the shtetls, or was that because they themselves wanted to be in shtetls? The answer is, of course, probably a little bit of both. But I'm thinking of my favorite line from Fiddler on the Roof. And just because, again, the lead actor passed away, I'll quote it, where in the opening song tradition, they go to the rabbi and they ask the rabbi, "Rabbi, is there a prayer for the Tsar?" And the rabbi says, "Of course there's a prayer for the Tsar. I pray that the Tsar," and then he pauses, "stays far away from us." And then the song continues. And it's always my favorite line because I think it really encompasses Jewish view and sociology and society during the Pale of Settlement, which was this, on the one hand, was a time of insular Jewish communities, mostly because the rest of the public, again, didn't want much to do with Jews. Jews were generally left alone by the wider government, although they were, of course, confined to live in this specific area of the Pale of Settlement. But this produced an immense amount of a lot of the old school Eastern European Ashkenazi culture that, at least myself, is certainly part of my family's history. And so a lot of what we think about when we talk about Ashkenazi foods or Eastern European Ashkenazi culture, right? This was created over this 120, 130 years in the Pale of Settlement. And actually at the height of the Pale of Settlement, so in the early 1900s, before the Russian Revolution, there were 5 million Jews that were living in the Pale, which roughly was just under 50% of Jews worldwide. So there is a good chance that if you are a Ashkenazi Jew, that you had a parent, grandparent, great-grandparent, great-great-grandparent, like living in either the Pale or what was the former Pale of Settlement. And so this, of course, had a massive influence on Jewish culture, the way Judaism's practiced, a lot of Jewish foods and everything like that. Just one such area that I wanted to zoom into, and then we will quickly travel west back to Western Europe, is, of course, Yiddish culture, where I really could have stuck this in at any previous class, because Yiddish, of course, started in the medieval period. So it's not that Yiddish was invented in the Pale of Settlement, but it, of course, was the go-to language of Jews living in the Pale, which, even just to take a step back, is a really interesting sociological glimpse into the Jewish community in Eastern Europe, because they were speaking a language that was different than the wider public. And this is not this was not the norm for Judaism in the diaspora, right? We've spoken a lot about Judaism being enmeshed in different cultures. And so we spoke probably, it feels like many months ago, but probably 7 or 8 classes ago, of once the Jewish center moved to Babylonia, all of a sudden Jewish texts are written in Arabic. And then once the Jewish center moves to Spain, Jewish sources start to be written still in Arabic because it was Islamic controlled, but also in Spanish or Ladino, which is Spanish mixed with a little bit of Hebrew and things like that. Yiddish, of course, is a mixture of German, Hebrew, and Aramaic to create this really interesting, I'm going to call it a Frankenstein-like language. I don't mean that in a negative connotation, but it really is sort of a patchwork of different languages. And this was the de facto language that Jews spoke about. And just one more thing to say on Yiddish is that there's all these interesting scholarly theories as to how was the language of Yiddish actually created. And a lot of people suggest that it was sort of a bottom up, almost like I'm trying to think of the word, when you have a group of people that have many different cultural influences and they just end up merging languages. So almost the same way that if you have an Israeli American or a Mexican American or a Persian American today, the language that they speak at home might be Hebrew mixed with a little bit of English, and you'll have sentences that are mixed up that'll be, they'll call their parents Abba and Ima, which in Hebrew means mom and dad, but then the rest of the sentence will be in English. And you just imagine that same process happening over and over again, generation after generation, eventually creating a language that is kind of German, but not quite German, kind of sounds like Hebrew, but not quite Hebrew, kind of sounds like Aramaic. And so that is, of course, Yiddish. And Yiddish was the language of Jewish cultural influence, especially in Eastern Europe, but even in Western Europe until the mid-1800s, which we'll talk a little bit about in a second. And so this was the language that all of the wider communal discussions were happening in, right? It didn't make a difference if you were religious, secular, right? There was a lot of music and theater that was written in Yiddish. This was the language of Hasidic Jews. There was a lot of socialist pamphlets and socialist arguments being made in Yiddish. And of course, all of the early Zionists were also writing, at least the ones from Eastern Europe, were writing in Yiddish. But then all of a sudden, and this is my favorite part about Yiddish, is that it's probably ends up being one of the more argumentative inspired languages, because Yiddish over the past 150 years in Jewish life has undergone a number of wider community battles. And even today, when you bring up Yiddish, people tend to have strong opinions about it, which I find interesting. So first, you have a secular battle over Yiddish, which we'll talk about a little bit once we travel to Western Europe. But a number of Jewish leaders, especially after the Enlightenment, began to feel increasingly that Yiddish was holding back the Jews. Why would Yiddish be holding back the Jews? Because Yiddish is, by definition, an insular language. And so if I raise my child only speaking Yiddish, and that's their first language, and that's the language that they're used to reading and writing in, obviously they're not going to be able to assimilate into wider culture as well. And so there was an attack from Jewish Enlightenment leaders on Yiddish, basically trying to drive home the argument, why are you teaching children Yiddish, right? Really, you should be teaching them French, or if you're in England, English, or if you're in Germany, German. And so Yiddish first comes under attack in the early to mid 1800s, where again, you have these Jewish leaders pushing for assimilation, and very similar almost to the Jewish community today. Today, you have a really interesting glimpse into Yiddish, because there's really only 2 groups of people in the Jewish world that still speak Yiddish. One are academics or people that have a very interest into Yiddish, which is a very tiny population. And then the other, of course, is Hasidic Jews, which still today in both America and Israel raise their children with their first language being Yiddish. And so if you travel, if we, all took a class trip and we traveled to New Square in New York, or we traveled to Bnei Barak in Israel, and we walked around, it's fascinating. The language that you hear on the streets is Yiddish. And this is a purposeful educational choice made by leaders of the community, right? There's, of course, nothing wrong with the language of English or nothing wrong with the language of Hebrew, but this is an educational choice of, if you raise a child in New York and their first language is Yiddish, obviously that's going to increase their chances of staying within the fold because you quite literally cannot communicate with anybody else. And so there was a big push by early Enlightenment Jews to not teach Yiddish, because if you want a child to grow up and you want the Jewish community to start assimilating more, as anybody sitting in this room, right, usually the word assimilation has a negative connotation. I just want to flag that. For the purpose that I'm using assimilation, we are all assimilationists by the way that I'm using it. Because the very fact that we speak English, that we have some idea of which movies might have won awards over the weekend, we listen to music produced outside of the Jewish community, we've probably gone to a library in the last couple of months, we are all to some extent on the spectrum of assimilated Jews. The other battle over Yiddish, and this was a much more intense battle, and so we can talk about this a little bit more when we talk about Zionism in a week or two, was that there was a big Zionist battle over Yiddish. And one of my favorite historical episodes is something called the Language Wars. And so if anybody is bored later, you can go on Google and just Wikipedia the Language Wars. Because what happened was, of course, one of the things that early Zionists were trying to do is reclaim a national identity in our ancient homeland, right? We'll talk about this more next week or the week after. And one of the ways in which early Zionistic leaders thought you would do that is by reclaiming an ancient language. And so you have all of these Zionist idealistic leaders, right? Of course, the most famous is Eliezer ben Yehuda, of who there's a street in Tel Aviv named after him and a street in Jerusalem named after him. But all of a sudden, they started saying, we don't want anybody in, then it was, again, British Mandate Palestine. We don't want anybody in Palestine speaking Yiddish, because Yiddish is the language of the diaspora and the language of the exiles. And from some early Zionist perspective, again, we'll talk about this more when we talk about Zionism, diasporic and exilic Jews are weak. And Yiddish is a weak language. Yiddish is an insular language. We are recreating the image of Jews. We are now strong. We have our own land. We've returned. And we need a strong language. And so, of course, a lot of the ways in which we see this manifesting, right, one just obvious way is all of the early Zionists who changed their name from very Ashkenazi Yiddishy sounding names to very Hebrew sounding names, right? There's tons of examples of this, right? Even a lot of American Jews a generation or two ago changed their names from very Yiddishy Ashkenazi sounding names to Hebrew or even more American sounding names. But this was a huge fight for, let's say, you have a public school system in Israel that was being created by the early Zionist movement. Which language do you teach children in? And it was not taken for granted at all that Hebrew was going to be the language. If you dropped on the streets of British Mandate Palestine in 1920, the language that you would have been hearing is probably anything but Hebrew. I mean, the reinvention of Hebrew required a colossal effort by Eliezer ben Yehuda and his group. And they did things that, by all historical accounts, just seem crazy. I mean, Eliezer ben Yehuda's two children at one point were the only people in the world who were fluent in Hebrew, and that was the only language that they knew. I mean, they basically forced, I'm saying forced as a good thing here, not as a negative, but they basically forced the language of Hebrew back into existence. They said, okay, we have this language, we want it to be spoken. The only way to do it is almost full immersion and not give anybody a choice. But there were the Yiddish purists that were still in Israel, that were still, say, writing news articles in Yiddish. And where we get to the reason why I use the term battle is because there actually were battles going back and forth in early Palestine between Zionist camp and Yiddish camp. And I think at one point this went to such an extreme that one of the Zionist pro-Hebrew groups ended up firebombing the newspaper factory of one of the widespread Yiddish newspapers. And so Yiddish ended up, again, becoming this language that was shrouded in controversy, because to some extent, if you are trying, right, the reason why I'm spending so much time on Yiddish is because during the Enlightenment and the Haskalah, we saw a number of attempts by Jewish thinkers. And again, everybody here is going to have to make a judgment for themselves as to who they think is right? I'm not going to say right or wrong in an ethical sense. I'll present the historical facts and people can come to whatever conclusions they want. But there was an attempt to say the medieval or early modern Jewish existence in Europe with insular shtetl communities and Yiddish and us being sort of these meek insular groups, right? That was sort of the darker ages of Jewish history. And now we are trying to recreate Judaism. Whether you're recreating Judaism as strong Zionistic leaders who are able to work the land, whether you're recreating Jewish image as intellectual assimilationists who can participate in the best of European or American culture, it doesn't matter. The Haskalah, or the Enlightenment, as we'll see in a minute, was an attempt to move Judaism from A to B, whereas A was seen as a dark age of Jewish history, and Yiddish became the representative of that dark age of Jewish history. And so we get just some interesting pamphlets here, just so you can see that how Yiddish was used, right? This is obviously a socialist pamphlet from sometime in the early 1900s. This is a COVID warning that I think is from one of these Hasidic enclaves in New York. And again, we obviously know, right, Shalom Aleichem was one of the most famous Yiddish playwrights, and he writes a comedy in Yiddish. And so just to take a step back, we can imagine and understand how rich Yiddish culture was, and sort of the triple historical events of the Haskalah, Zionism, and then of course the Holocaust basically wiped out Yiddish culture to the extent that today Yiddish plays a very small role in the lives of the vast majority of Jews, even the Jews whose grandparents also, I mean, all of my grandparents, their first language or their second language was Yiddish. They were all fluent in Yiddish. My parents know a tiny bit of Yiddish. I was never, I mean, aside from just a couple of phrases here and there, I was never taught any Yiddish. And that was a conscious choice by my high school that was a Orthodox high school, but a modern Orthodox high school, to say, we are going to teach you English and Hebrew, right? No Yiddish. And so again, all of these educational choices are very conscious. And so the Jewish community, or much of the Jewish community, basically taught Yiddish out of the Jewish experience. If anybody has any thoughts about Yiddish, again, I started this by saying Yiddish always, you always get strong feelings about Yiddish, but just to go through a little bit of the history before we travel westward. So again, feel free to just cut me off. So at the same time that the Pale of Settlement was happening and everything was happening that we were talking about in Eastern Europe, all of a sudden the ghetto doors opened both literally and metaphorically in Western Europe. And so this means that if you imagine, right, this is, again, one glimpse of the Roman ghetto, right, of where Jews had to live in Rome. This is a picture of the ghetto in Rome right now, of course. One way to conceptualize this, again, hundreds of years of Jews living in Western Europe, confined to specific places by law. All of a sudden, within one act of legislation, right? It started in France in the late 1700s, but then the rest of Western European states in the early 1800s followed suit, issued decrees basically writing equality into the law for Jews. And so all of a sudden you have all of these sociological forces on the Jewish community that starts breeding a massive amount of assimilation and secularization. And to some extent, again, it makes a lot of sense, right? You open the floodgates and now you tell your young Jewish child, no longer do you have to stay within this 1 square mile and be a weaver, as your dad was a weaver and your grandfather was a weaver. Now you can go anywhere and do whatever you want, right? That second option sounds a little bit more exciting if you're 17, 18, 19. And so you start to see this high level of secularization, assimilation happening in the Jewish community. And much of what ends up happening in the late 1700s and 1800s is an attempt to balance out this rush of secularization that you have in the Jewish community. And so we get to our sort of first Jewish leader figure. And Moses Mendelssohn, of course, spent most of his life right before any of the revolutions. And so he was writing and acting at a time that was before Jews were formally granted equality, but at a time where the culture and ethos in Europe was definitely moving towards enlightenment and the loss of power of religion over the public sphere. And Moses Mendelssohn, I think I mentioned before that there's, we keep getting introduced to famous Moseses, So we had Moses Rabbeinu, obviously, Moses Maimonides. We had, why am I forgetting the other? Oh, the Moses, the Ramah, who wrote the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and then Moses Mendelssohn, who all were awarded this epithet of being, the greatest Moses since Moses. And so just a couple of words about Moses Mendelssohn, why he was so important. So he is an early Enlightenment figure, and so he becomes famous and well-known, not just in Jewish circles, but in wider academic Enlightenment circles also, and we'll see why in a minute. And one of his extremely important projects was called the Bior, which in Hebrew, again, Bior comes from the root or, which means light, which quite literally means the enlightened. And this project was an attempt to translate the Bible into German. Now, this should immediately bring us back to, again, 7 or 8 weeks ago, when Saadia Gaon translates the Torah into Arabic, because translation is a very powerful tool, right? What does it mean to translate a work into a different language? It means two things. One, it means you're already admitting, or you're already granting the fact that many Jews don't know the original, right? So if I were to come in, right, or the fact that, let's say, in virtually all synagogues in America, our Sidurim, our prayer books, right, and it doesn't matter if you go into an Orthodox synagogue, a Reform, Conservative, any of them, almost all Sidurim also have the English translation side by side. And so just already sociologically, that tells us that at least a plurality of people walking into that room don't actually know what the words say, right? They need the translation, right? So him already translating the Torah into German meant a few things. One, it meant that there were a growing number of Jews who spoke German and did not understand biblical Hebrew. And he actually takes it one step further, where he was trying to convince the Jewish community to accept wider German culture. And so one of the ways that you do that is you write a translation of the Torah into German, and you slowly sprinkle in Enlightenment ideas into your commentary and translation of the Bible. And so it's a fascinating translation / commentary. Again, the line between translation and commentary always gets blurred, because every translation is in effect some sort of commentary on the book that you're talking about. But Moses Mendelssohn has this, again, fascinating translation of the Torah, where he starts using these culturally German ideas in an attempt to talk to the wider Jewish public, and also slowly convince them that German and German culture is sort of, for lack of a better word, kosher, right? How bad could this language be if you're studying Torah in it, right? And this was, again, at a time when you could imagine the vast majority of Jews and Jewish leaders were saying, no, stay in the shtetl, speak Yiddish. So he was trying to give it the push, but obviously still do it within Jewish traditional garb. And then finally, the most important thing that he writes is this massive tome called Jerusalem, and the subtext is on religious power and Judaism, where he puts forward an argument that predates a lot of other Enlightenment thinkers in arguing for a separation of church and state. And this is a masterful book, because what he does is he starts to drive home this, he almost predicted the plight that European Jews were going to have over the next generation or two. And he writes this book arguing to the wider public that you can, and it's actually better for a society to have different ethnic and religious subgroups. And so he's almost writing this book to the wider European audience. And we'll see a quote from this book in a second, to the wider European audience saying, yes, Jews are different. Yes, we're going to try to remain different, but no, that does not detract from our belonging to the wider cultural project of Western European countries. And this is, of course, going to be a major theme that we're going to see the rest of today, which is this tension that Jews were caught within Europe right after the Enlightenment. And in a sense, what the Jewish community was being asked was quite unfair, because from some perspective, you have about 1,000 years of segregation, 1,000 years of state-sponsored anti-Semitism, 1,000 years of, again, most of Europe being controlled by the church and Jews being second-class, if not worse citizens. All of a sudden, within a few strokes of the pen, Jews are given equal rights. And then the next week, they're expected to check all parts of their Jewish identity and immediately assimilate into the wider culture, or else people would write these fiery op-eds about them the Jews are not assimilating, they're remaining to themselves. And so you have this really fascinating interplay, and people like Moses Mendelssohn were an early attempt to try to combat this type of thinking, of trying to be one of the first people to say, you actually can do both, right? And this is something that, again, I'll just speak for myself, but I would almost guarantee this goes for everybody in this Zoom right now. We all take for granted that, of course, we can be part of a Jewish community and be good American citizens, whatever we want to mean by that. But this would have been a very novel concept in the early to mid 1700s of being both Jewish and German, or Jewish and French, and all these things. And so we'll see that a lot of the Jewish Enlightenment, or a lot of the Haskalah, was an attempt to navigate these different pressures. And just to see one quote, maybe I'll ask Maddie, you want to do some reading here? Just because this is such a interesting and prescient quote by Mendelssohn here.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I didn't know what the headphones. Okay. A union of faiths, if it were ever to come about, could have only the most disastrous consequences for reason and freedom of conscience. If the goal of this universal delusion were to be realized, I'm afraid man's barely liberated mind would once again be confined behind bars. Brothers and sisters, if you care for true godliness, let us not pretend that conformity exists where diversity is obviously the plan and goal of providence. Not one among us thinks and feels exactly like his fellow men. Why then should we deceive each other with lies? It is sad enough that we are doing this in our daily relations, in conversations that are of no particular importance. But why also in matters which concern our temporal and eternal welfare, our very destiny? Why should we use masks to make ourselves unrecognizable to each other in the most important concerns of life, when God has given each of us his own distinctive face for some good reason?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maddie. So I love this source because, again, this is Moses Mendelssohn writing in the mid 1700s. So this is really almost 300 years ago. And he's driving home an argument that I think much of the Jewish community has really taken to heart, and hopefully much wider liberal 20th and 21st century identity has taken to heart, which is that pluralism and the fact that we don't all have the same culture, religion, ethnicity is a net positive for society and not a net negative. And so, again, he's writing this to an audience that was totally not be historically receptive to this. I mean, if you just think about, right, this is, again, still before many of the revolutions, or before all of the revolutions. This was still at a time, again, the power of the church was waning, but this was still at a time where to be a good European was to be a Christian, right, usually white, right, male, all of these things. And he's basically saying, right, this is just a falsehood, right? It's a religious argument for pluralism, and one that I think cuts very deep, and one that both heavily influenced the Jewish community. I mean, this sounds exactly like a beautiful Yom Kippur sermon that you can imagine somebody giving next year. And also, this would be a message that was written for the wider audience. And we don't have time, again, to get into all the academic and biographical weeds here, but there's a lot of really interesting research about how Mendelssohn affected a lot of the late 18th century Enlightenment thinkers that obviously influenced America and liberalism and democracy and all of these ideas, right? There's a lot of interesting research that shows that they all read Mendelssohn and sort of took these arguments to heart. And so Moses Mendelssohn, just going back to our previous slide here, right? So he's writing again in the mid 1800s, and to some extent, he is writing to predict this important time that Judaism was about to go into over the next 100 years. And so we introduce, right, the Haskalah, and Moses Mendelssohn is usually the face of the Haskalah. Again, the Haskalah just means the Jewish Enlightenment. And just to give some hard dates and hard definitions here, right, the Haskalah comes right after the European Enlightenment. And so first, wider Europe went through the Enlightenment, and then the Jewish community that was sort of one generation behind, again, because it takes a while for these ideas to go into the shtetls and the ghettos, have the Haskalah. The Haskalah, the first thing that happened was emancipation. And so we're talking about the time period here of 1770 to 1881. So this 111 years is a crucial time in Jewish history, specifically in Europe. And what happened here, right? So of course, emancipating Jews of Western Europe comes with major challenges. And so we'll talk both about the pluses and the minuses. Again, I'm not making a moral argument for whether or not I think the Haskalah was good or bad, right? I think that, it's pretty foolish to do that because something as multifaceted as this obviously has many pluses and many minuses, and we can decide for ourselves what we think afterwards. But all of a sudden, the Jewish community ran into, of course, a lot of problems, right? One, we'll just focus on the physical problems, which will, again, be a major theme throughout the next 2 and 3 weeks, which is, well, what do you know? Even when Napoleon, or even when the head of England issues a decree saying Jews are now equal citizens, that does not cure the populace of anti-Semitism. And so all of a sudden, you have a problem, which is, for most of Jewish history, anti-Semitism was, again, top down, right? You had a centralized institution, whether it be a government, whether it be the Islamic Authority, whether it be the Catholic Church, you had a centralized institution that was legislating anti-Semitism. All of a sudden, that centralized institution says no more state-sponsored anti-Semitism, right? Jews are now equal citizens, treat them as such. But of course, right, your average person is not going to one day wake up, read the letter from Napoleon, say, you're right. We were wrong to be treating the Jews like that. Okay, let's fully accept them and integrate them into equal society. And so this, of course, presented a problem for the Jewish community, because it's one thing when the centralized institution is anti-Semitic. To some extent, at least you know where it's coming from, right? I'm not going to say one is better or worse than the other. But now there's a situation where on paper, Jews are equal, but in practice, they're, of course, not equal at all. And there's still growing anti-Semitism. So that's going to be one challenge that we'll discuss. And sort of a subtext of this is something called the Jewish question, which we'll get to on the next slide. The next major challenge, which we'll also talk about today, is the intellectual, religious, and cultural challenge this brings to Judaism. Because again, it is very easy, and this is actually, funny enough, we have these same sociological undertones in the Jewish community today. It's very easy to keep a community united and together when you are confined to one shtetl in the corner of town and nobody's allowed to leave and everybody's speaking the same language. You're probably not going to have a very high rate of people dropping out of Judaism. All of a sudden, when all of those things get lifted, yeah, sure, there's still some anti-Semitism, but now when a child has infinite number of options and they actually embrace liberalism to its extreme, which is, right, one of the ideas of liberalism is individualism, right? So no longer do you feel, or no longer should you feel, attached to any specific community or tradition. Everybody is a fully autonomous being and should make whatever choices they want, right? Obviously, that's a very reductive definition, but a lot of young Jews were embodying these same ideas, and you started to see masses of Jews that were simply saying, okay, I don't need to be Jewish anymore. Okay, I will take off my kippah, I'll enter into the university, I'll leave the shtetl, and I'll never come back again. And so, of course, Jewish leaders had this major challenge of, what do you do when you start to see Pew study after Pew study in the year 1820 in Germany, and it's saying that the next generation of Jews are doomed because they don't want to be, they're not interested in Jewish life. And so this was another challenge. And then, of course, one of the subtexts of this is tradition versus modernity, right? How do you balance this interplay of everything that we've held sacred for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years? And also, how do you become a modern, again, at this point, European that's participating in the wider society? Just so we can see a map of when different countries around Europe actually issued the emancipation and equal rights for Jews. So this, of course, starts in France, and several other Western European countries start right after. Right in Eastern Europe, it goes until the early 1900s in terms of actual emancipation, and then I think Spain is last with 1930. But you can sort of see the map that over the late 17 and early 1800s, one by one, restrictions were being lifted off the Jews, and Jewish community leaders were basically stuck holding the box and trying to figure out all of these sociological questions that now newly appeared. And so we'll take these questions one by one. And again, if anybody has thoughts here, feel free to interrupt whenever. So this is one of, I think, the most interesting questions to come out of emancipation. And so if you look at this little picture here, that is the French emancipation, right? I don't actually speak French, but this is the beginning of the edict by Napoleon in 1791, saying that the Jews are now equal citizens. And France actually, to some extent, still many hundred years later, is still dealing with this question of to be French is to be French and to hold no other commitments to anything else, right? There's actually, constantly being laws passed in France against public wearing of kippah or hijab and things like that. So that's one interesting side point. This did not start in the 21st century. This started in the late 18th century. But one such question we get is called the Jewish question. Now, a couple things about the term the Jewish question. In the year 2023, if you see anybody use the term the Jewish question in a non-historical situation, it's probably coming from something anti-Semitic, right? Nobody today still talks about the Jewish question as a reasonable way to portray this debate that I'm about to lay out. But the Jewish question started off actually as an internal Jewish question. And so you had all of these Jewish thinkers that were writing in the 1800s about the Jewish question. Now, what is the Jewish question? So we have all of these writers tackling the Jewish question, right? We have Bruno Bauer, we have Karl Marx, we have Louis Brandeis, obviously offering very different answers to how to solve the Jewish question. But the Jewish question goes as follows, right? Most basically, the Jewish question is, who are the Jews, right? And this question has major ramifications because all of a sudden, again, from the perspective of France, let's say, you now say that the Jews are equal citizens and they're free to be Frenchmen. You also have a vision as Napoleon of what a Frenchman or French person should be. Are Jews a minority religious group that can easily accept the civil law of the host state? Meaning, can we expect that in the year 1791, that all French Jews are now going to immediately accept all of the cultural and legal and nationalistic baggages of being French, even though for the past 1,000 years, Ashkenazi Jews had their own court system? I mean, if we think about the functioning of medieval European Jewish villages, if I sued Henry in a dispute because his wagon hit my wagon as we were entering into synagogue on a Tuesday, I'm not going to take Henry to the secular court, God forbid. I mean, Jews were actually excommunicated in the medieval ages if I were to try to sue Henry and bring him to a secular court, because it always spelled trouble for the Jewish community. And so it's best that you stay as far away from the non-Jewish authorities as possible. And so I would take Henry to a Beit Din, and you would have 3 rabbis that were sitting there, and they would hear our case, and they would decide, no, actually, it was Daniel's fault, right? He was backing up his wagon and not paying attention, and so Henry doesn't have to pay. And I would basically be forced to accept that ruling, not because the Jewish court had the backing of the power of the state, right? It's not that if I didn't pay, the court can call the cops, because there were no cops. They had something far worse. The court had the power to excommunicate me. And if you were a medieval Ashkenazi Jew and you were excommunicated, that was it, right? You had nowhere to go, right? You could try to go to a new village and start it new, right? But it wasn't so simple. It was your entire social circle, your family, your community, your business life. And so for thousands of years or hundreds of years, this was the modality by which Jews acted. All of a sudden, somebody knocks on the synagogue door on some random Tuesday in 1791 and says, okay, French Jews, are you all ready to be complete Frenchmen? And to say, okay, yes, you can still go to synagogue every Saturday, but this is now just a religious identity, right? This can't be your wider legal framework and your cultural framework and your nationalistic framework. And so Jewish thinkers, again, were thinking about this question, like, oh my God, what are we? And just to point out one more thing, right? A lot of times questions of defining identity only become tangible once you're in a situation where you have to explain it to somebody. Meaning, as somebody who's Jewish, or you could think of any identity, right? There's a certain ease at which people intuitively understand their own identity and the idiosyncrasies about that. The second you're then coming to somebody that doesn't have that identity and trying to explain what it means to have the identity, all of a sudden you get tongue-tied and it's really tough to explain, well, what does it mean to be a Jew, right? Are we in the 21st century? Are we Americans that happen to be of the religion called Judaism? Are we a part of this global peoplehood called the Jewish people? And we also happen to be American citizens? Are we somewhere in between, right? All of these questions that the Jewish community still deals with, right? This is what the Jewish question was. So are we a religion? Are we an ethnic group, or more nefariously a race? Are we a peoplehood? And regardless of what we are, what do we need to do in order to actually get equal acceptance? That was the second half of the Jewish question. And so the reason why I called this the paradox of modernity is that there was a catch-22, which was the Jews are now finally on paper equal, but nothing they do as Jews is actually giving them equality. And so sure, a Jew in, let's say, the 1800s can say, okay, Jews are now equal citizens, so I'm going to accept all of the benefits of equality, but that would almost by definition require them giving up any integral part of Jewish identity. And so the question was, are Jews actually equal during the emancipation, or was it that Jews now got a choice to say, you can basically throw off all parts of Jewish identity and take equality or remain Jewish? And if it's the second one, how different is that from medieval anti-Semitism under the church, where Jews were also given a choice, convert to Christianity or remain Jewish? And so these are just some interesting questions to think about. And so, of course, you have all of these attempts to try to explain, right, what is going to save the Jewish community from this catch-22. And so we can probably guess the answers of our thinkers here, right? Just to name one, right? Of course, Karl Marx writes his book on the Jewish question. Marx was, of course, both Jewish and probably harbored some views that we would find very distasteful and questionable now in terms of specifically his view on Jews. But Karl Marx's answer, of course, is that Jews have to join the revolution, and only once the revolution happens, right, Jews will be awarded equality and equal citizen, right? Louis Brandeis, who of course is writing in America at a later time, right, writes basically a similar argument to Karl Marx, but talks about liberalism as a saving grace of Jews, right? Jews have to just become 20th century liberals, and then anti-Semitism will be solved. But time after time again, all of these attempts to solve the Jewish question were being thrown up onto the chalkboard. And for lack of a better term, none of them were working in an all-encompassing way, which next week when we talk about Zionism, right? Zionism was also an answer to the Jewish question, but we'll save that for next week. But this was, again, one such question that the Jewish community was dealing with. And this was, again, in the height of increased bottom-up anti-Semitism that was happening. And of course, again, the form of economic anti-Semitism, right? This is at a time where later on in Eastern Europe, you start to have the book, The Protocols of Elders of Zion, coming out that claims that there's a international Jewish conspiracy theory to cause wars and run the banks and all the things that we now know today as sort of classic anti-Semitic tropes. You had social and ethnic anti-Semitism, where Jews are being blamed for ills of society. And of course, this was not only a European phenomenon. As Jews started moving to America, you also start to see a lot of anti-Semitism there. I believe this is from the late 1800s, as Jews start moving more and more, the one on the right, of course, as Jews start to move more and more. And what's really interesting about this is anti-Semitism is always very hard to pick apart exactly what it is. But this is actually, I think, a really interesting example of a lot of the catch-22s that Jews found themselves in, because this is sort of every type of anti-Semitism mixed into one, right? You have this, you have the stereotypical racial anti-Semitism of portraying Jews with the big noses and everything like that. You have obviously Christian anti-Semitism, because this is full of quotes from the New Testament. And you have economic anti-Semitism, because this is basically saying Jews are on both sides of the political aisle, both of the extremes, and basically doing whatever they can to screw over the average American. And so Jews, again, were caught in this catch-22, which I don't want to talk too much about anti-Semitism, because we'll eventually get there more with next week. But this was, again, one question that the Jewish community was dealing with. And this was one facet of the Jewish problem or the Jewish question, which is, if you're a Jewish leader, how do you fix this, right? Is there a way to fix this, right? Obviously, a lot of Jewish thinkers thought there was no way to fix this, which introduces Zionism and other things. But still in the 1800s, most Jewish leaders thought that Europe was going to be the future of Jews, until eternity. And so how do you actually create an environment where Jews are able to fit in and still remain Jewish while also participating in the public sphere? So one of the most interesting parts about that, so we'll do this and then we'll take some time for questions before we get into the sort of last half of today, right? One of the most interesting historical events here was Napoleon's Grand Sanhedrin. And so, right, just to review some dates here, it was 1791 that Napoleon issued emancipation for the Jews. And so now, 15 years later, Napoleon is under increased pressure by a lot of people in his government to rethink his granting emancipation to American Jews, right? So just lest we think that emancipation for Jews was a, green light and then everything's happily ever after for European Jews, right? This will give us some immediate pause. And they started with all of, again, the classic anti-Semitic notions of, well, are Jews really loyal French people? Maybe the Jews are part of this international, vast conspiracy. And maybe if we go to war, as French was embroiled in a lot of wars in the 1800s, how do we know that Jews are going to be on our side? And so Napoleon gathers a group of 120 Jewish leaders from all over the French Jewish community and asks them a series of very pointed questions of, we're just wondering, you guys have this Jewish community. Are Jews allowed to marry Christians, or can Jews only marry themselves? In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen considered brethren or strangers? What conduct does Jewish law prescribe towards Frenchmen not of the Jewish religion? Do Jews born in France and treated by the law as French citizens acknowledge France as their country? Are they bound to defend it? Are they bound to obey the laws and directions of the civil code? What about the rabbis? What type of jurisdiction do they have? What judicial power do they have? Are police jurisdiction of the rabbis in the form of election regulated by Jewish law, or is that only a custom, right? These are fascinating questions to present to the Jewish community, because again, everything we're talking about before, this is Napoleon, again, asking this group of 120 Jewish leaders. And again, these of course are not questions. These are very pointed, right? You better give me the right answer or else. And this is basically saying, I need a guarantee from the Jewish community that you are loyal Frenchmen, that you are French nationalists first and Jews second. Again, at a time where nationalism was still new and emancipation was still new. So again, Jews were caught in this catch-22 of how do you balance Napoleon's Grand Sanhedrin with the fact that the vast majority of Jews in France in the year 1806 were still extremely traditional, still living in insular Jewish communities. You have this really interesting historical inflection point where, again, at the stroke of a pen, Jews go from Esther has to live in this village at the corner of town and not associate with the public to all of a sudden, a year later, Esther cannot live, parked away in this corner of town and has to engage in public. And so this 180 flip, again, put the Jewish community through a lot of historical pressure cooker in terms of the cultural influence. And so now we get, of course, or before we go to the way in which, of course, the Jewish community responds, let's just take a step back. I know I just talked for a lot there, but any thoughts, questions, comments, anything like that before we move to Jewish responses here? Perfect. Okay. So again, feel free to just cut me off if anybody thinks of something. So, oh yeah, go for it.
I don't know how to use Fred's iPad, but I did want to say that this was a very complicated time in France where it wasn't just Jews that were thrown into this mix. France had a complicated relationship between Protestants and Catholics and, and hundreds of years of fighting. And so there was all kinds of complications about trying to get everybody on board. Are you French first or are you religious first? And I think that was going on in many countries at that time. And the United States, which said total separation of religion and politics, that was kind of the culmination of all of this. And maybe you'll get there next week or the next, couple of weeks.
Yeah, 100%. And maybe it is a historical accident. I don't know enough about French politics in the late 1700s. I mean, it could have been a historical accident that given that France was first in terms of emancipation in Europe, a lot of other Western European countries just sort of followed France's playbook by asking the Jewish community similar questions. I mean, maybe history would have played out really differently if Germany was the first country. Germany was a lot more liberal once they granted emancipation than France was, in terms of allowing subgroups and things like that. So it might have been because France happened to be the first European country to issue emancipation for the Jews, and France had all of these, unique cultural sensitivities around, different infighting and what it means to be a French person and what it means to have a minority identity while being a French person, that maybe it sort of pushed a lot of these pressures onto other countries. It's a really interesting thought there. One other really interesting fallout, right? So France becomes the center of the Jewish community in terms of influence, at least for a short amount of time in the early 1800s. And so just to visit the Middle East a little bit, so we can talk about this for 5 minutes before talking about the inside European interactions, was Jews in the Middle East, again, for hundreds of years, and this is something we spoke about before, there was a major Jewish population in the Middle East here, and the Ottoman Empire until now had been quite good to the Jews. And so again, being a Jew that lived under the Ottoman Empire in, say, the year 1750 would have probably been preferable to being a Jew living anywhere in Europe. But all of a sudden, we start to see some turmoil happening for the Jewish community there. And so one of the more notorious acts to happen was called the Damascus Affairs. And the Damascus Affairs was a blood libel that happened in Syria. And again, you had, all of the natural underwritings of any blood libel that you think, right? A group official's child went missing and the Jews were blamed for that. And there was sort of a whole series of pogroms and riots against the Jewish community. And now for the 17 and 1800s, a pogrom is not that historically interesting. I mean, sadly, that happened a lot. What is historically interesting is that this is the first time this is really happening in the Middle East. And so 1840 is usually seen as a moment in time where we start to see a lot of classical Western anti-Semitism being imported into the Middle East. And today, right, of course, if we think about where a lot of the legacy of a lot of anti-Semitic tropes have traveled, right, obviously it still exists in America or Europe, but the Middle East tends to be much more anti-Semitic in terms of views and ideas than the vast majority of people in the West. So even just thinking of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, which of course circulated throughout Eastern and then Western Europe all throughout the late 18 and early 1900s, today it's probably selling hundreds of thousands of copies in Arabic. And if you look at Pew polling from the wider Middle East, right, views about Jews are probably similar to if you did a Pew poll in Europe in the year 1600 about what people think about Jews and things like that. And so the Damascus Affairs, again, comes as a unique historical situation that, of course, there were other things happening in global politics that ended up connecting the Middle East to Europe at this time, right? This is obviously during early colonialism. And so you started to have the import of a lot of Western ideas, right? So we can endlessly argue about like whose fault, quote unquote, this is, but you all of a sudden start to see a lot of anti-Semitism brewing in the Middle East. And again, for the first time, Mizrahi Jews, who for the vast majority of history fared much better under wider Islamic rule than Christian rule, we start to see, right, the slow inklings of a switch that now I think we all take for granted in the 21st century, that being under Western rule for Jews is better than being under any Middle Eastern rule, right? That would not have been the case in the 1700s and 1800s. And now we start to see the inkling of a switch. You also see, and this is why it's really historical interesting, that this is the first time that the American Jewish community starts to gather and starts to say, we as a community in America, who's a tiny community, by the way. There are 15,000 American Jews in 1840. Again, this is before any major Aliyah. It was mostly a group of actually Sephardic Jews that lived in the Northeast, right? You can go today to Newport, Rhode Island, and see the Turo Synagogue, right? Still standing there, right? That was the first synagogue in America. This is the first time that American Jews started petitioning the government to say, we need to do something. We need to get on the streets and actually bring political activism to the forefront, which again is a very unique American thing, right? Jews in Europe in the year 1840 were not marching on the streets demanding that public officials do something to help Jews in the Middle East because they were worried about their own safety. And so even when we'll talk more about America, either again next week or the week after. I still need to figure out which makes more sense. We've always had this sort of Jewish exceptionalism where from the outset of 1776, right? And I don't want to end down going a rabbit hole of American exceptionalism versus not, but from the outset of Jews living in America, we have always felt more comfortable here, given that the underpinnings of America were George Washington quite literally saying, yes, of course, Jews are equal. They can practice however they want, right? Doesn't mean there's never been anti-Semitism or anything like that, but it's very different to go from extreme anti-Semitism to then legislating away anti-Semitism to then, on the other hand, in America, starting off with no state legislated anti-Semitism. And so the Damascus Affairs, again, in the mid-1800s, creates this ripple effect throughout the rest of the Jewish world. And when it gets to France, you have, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. If anybody speaks French, they can come here and do a better job. But the Alliance Israelite Universelle, that for sure wasn't the correct pronunciation, in 1860, which was a group of French Jews that said, we should try to do something to help Middle Eastern Jews. And so this was, again, noted by scholars as a result of the Damascus Affairs, that now for one of the first times in history, since probably the destruction of the temple, you have this idea of a worldwide Jewish community start to emerge. Now, it doesn't mean that if you went to the 1200s and you asked a random Jew living in Eastern Europe and another Jew living in Iran, are you a part of the Jewish people? They, of course, would have said yes, but they had no idea what was happening in other communities. All of a sudden, you start to have this sense of Jews everywhere knowing what's happening to Jews everywhere. And this sense of we actually have to do something when Jews are in trouble elsewhere. And so this group of, again, French Jews begin to try to, again, they hop right on the back of French colonialism, because again, France was busy colonizing the Middle East and North Africa, where all the Mizrahi Jews lived at the time. But you started having French Jewish influence going into these communities and starting to teach secular subjects and actually teaching France and starting to teach a very Ashkenazi form of Judaism, which gets to the next part. And I was talking to a Hillel student of mine who was also in my Jewish studies class last year. He's going to grad school next year to study Jews in the Ottoman Empire. And so we were talking about this historic event last Shabbat when he was over, and he hated or hates the Alliance Israelite Universelle, because he basically said this was just a Jewish colonialist enterprise to basically say Ashkenazi post-Enlightenment Judaism is the way to go. And these backwards, Middle Eastern Jews, right, need to come in and basically be civilized. And so the legacy of a lot of these initiatives, again, is shrouded in controversy and things like that, because there was, to some extent, a superiority complex that was felt by the French Ashkenazi Jews as they were going into these more traditional, less secularly educated, more conservative Mizrahi Jewish communities. And the same thing happens, by the way, with Zionism, right? One of the major black boxes of the Zionist movement was, again, an attempt where you had about 1 million Jews coming in from the wider Arab world. And there was an attempt by mostly secular, atheistic, socialistic Zionist leaders to, as they came in, basically saying, okay, you're here now, enough of that, traditional, what they called, Eastern backwards, uncivilized culture, right? Now you have to be Europeanized. And so, again, we get a lot of this, this controversy. And again, this, of course, breeds right into early Zionism with the French Jewish community and other Western European communities feeling this idea of palpably feeling this idea of a Jewish peoplehood. Okay, So that was just our meanwhile snippet into the Middle East, and we are doing good on time because we have about 15 minutes left. And so we get to the grand finale, which is with all of these cultural and historical indicators in place, we can now very easily understand, right, the different denominations, which presented in a vacuum, right, it's very hard to understand Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism and Conservative Judaism, but now it's a lot more obvious, right? So the Reform movement started in Germany in the year 1820. So right in the middle of all of this, again, towards the beginning of the Haskalah and emancipation. And it was started by a guy named Abraham Geiger, who again was feeling all of these different societal pressures, where on the one hand, you want to present a form of Judaism that is going to mix in Enlightenment values. You're worried that if you don't, young Jews are just going to enter into the wider public sphere and just assimilate away. You also want to make sure they stay Jewish, right? So you don't want to just say, yeah, go ahead and go on and assimilate. And so you have all of these different effects. And so we meet a young rabbi named Abraham Geiger, who, of course, just like all other rabbis at that age, was given a very traditional rabbinic education and then went off to study secular philosophy. And he came up with this idea, right, that now, of course, I think we all take for granted. Again, and I'll move this picture so we can actually, all right, well, this is a hiding behind the picture, so we can guess what that word says. But he basically, of course, famously says, right, the Torah and the Talmud should be studied critically and from the perspective of evolution and development. And so again, he posits a much more slow, gradual evolution of Jewish life than a top-down, God said this and God said that, which of course gets into the modern field of Jewish studies and the idea that I think, again, a lot of us take for granted, where when I say that the Talmud developed over the course of hundreds of years, instead of being dropped on Moses's lap when he was up on Sinai, none of you are rushing to excommunicate me from the community. You are all saying, well, of course, right? How else could it happen, right? So a lot of that is due to the legacy of Abraham Geiger. And he starts to try to make Judaism more Christian-like. And again, here we get into interesting conversations of Reform Judaism, which is nothing I say here is normative, right? This is all descriptive, but I want to try to understand why Abraham Geiger and early Reform Judaism was doing what it did, and why now in the 21st century, Reform Judaism is very different than in Germany 200 years ago. And so one of the problems that Jews were facing, and this is everything we've talked about in the last hour, was that Jews on paper had equal rights, but when they went into the streets, they were still Jewish. And so that was obviously holding them back socially and professionally and culturally and everything like that. And so how do you take Judaism and make it seem less dangerous to the wider culture without giving up on it, right? Because of course, many Jews did say, well, if to be Jewish means it's going to hold me back, if I show up to, let's say, the local university and I'm wearing a kippah and I'm demanding that they give me special kosher food and I'm asking for specific days of the year off because of Jewish holidays and all of these things that make me seem, you know, weird and strange, well, of course, anti-Semitism is going to persist. And so I, of course, can say, okay, I'm done, right? I'm no longer Jewish. I'm just Daniel the German, right? Not Daniel the Jew. Abraham Geiger says, well, what if we sort of split the difference? What if we try to reform Judaism, right? I'll use the word reform here. What if we try to reform Judaism and try to basically have it both ways, have your cake and eat it too, by saying we're going to keep people Jewish, right? We're going to keep establishing Jewish identity, but we're going to make it seem to the wider public that Jews are not these strange, weird, ethnic peoplehood creatures that have nothing to do with your average German or French person, but that Jews are basically similar to Christians, just with a couple of different beliefs. Marilyn, I see you have a hand up. Go for it. All right, we'll get back to you. Whenever you unmute, just feel free to cut me off. Go for it. No?
This
Okay.
is a fascinating class and I'm extremely interested in it. And it leads me to a question that I've been puzzling over lately and reading a little about. So by these reforms, though, I mean, have these reforms led to some of the shrinking of Judaism, where people have been leaving the religion because they, just because it's not as close, it's not as powerful anymore, or, they can.
Yeah, it's a great point. And so if you give me 10 minutes when we go to the next slide, we'll introduce Orthodox Judaism, which came onto the scene with that exact argument. And the right answer is that from my perspective and from a historical perspective, I think it's more complicated. I think it's very easy to say from some perspective that in the 21st century, and I hope the last class we'll do about contemporary Judaism and talk about a lot of the Pew polling and statistics. I think it's very easy to say the argument of, well, if any group makes fewer demands, then of course it's going to have a higher drop-off rate. That's of course true. To some other extent, Reform Judaism might have saved Ashkenazi Judaism from completely assimilating. You would have had, the Orthodox community in the mid 1800s was quite small in Europe. And so this was an attempt to say, I'll take a step back. There are many other things in Jewish history that you can view as reformations. The Talmud, I think, is best thought of also as a reformation. It was, again, a group of leaders coming around and saying, we need to completely reform our ideas about Judaism and how to practice and all of these things to fit growing sociologic need, right? It doesn't mean that all reforms are good or bad, but the demands that, right, one of the problems that I think Reform Judaism has had, and again, I will talk about this more in 2 weeks, is that the same sociological and cultural pressures that the Jewish community was facing 200 years ago are almost the opposite of the cultural pressures that they're facing now. And so now I think the biggest danger for involving somebody in Jewish community is just apathy. Not, there's very little cultural or societal pressure, at least compared to 200 years ago, for young Jews to not be Jewish or to want to assimilate because of any perceived notion that the only way to get a good job or to fit in is to assimilate. Now, I think the biggest threat is just apathy, right? It's people saying, right, almost the, just because Passover is coming up, right? The wicked son at the Seder, right? Like, what is all this, right? Like, what do these rituals mean to you, right? Why should I find this interesting? So it's a great point, and hopefully we'll get there in a little bit. But at least for 1820, again, 200 years ago, the goal was, if we can make Judaism seem more church-like, if we can change the prayers from Hebrew to German, right? This is something that the early Reform movement did that, of course, still the contemporary Reform movement does, right? You hear a lot more English in a Reform congregation than you would at a conservative or Orthodox. And one of the other things that Abraham Geiger did, which is, again, right, we'll talk about all the ways in which Reform has changed or updated in the last 200 years, but completely neglected the ritual components of Judaism and only stressing the ethical or social justice components. Again, in an attempt to make Judaism seem as Protestant-like as possible, right? This is, right, Protestantism is not necessarily based off of ritual, it's based off of social ideas and philosophical ideas. They obviously changed the liturgy, right? And one of the most important changes of liturgy that they made, which of course is still the norm in Reformed communities, where there is no longer a prayer to rebuild the temple or wanting the rebuilding of the temple, right? We have cut off the Musaf prayer. And a lot of these changes were because they wanted to seem loyally German, right? It's very hard for you to say, no, I'm fully bought in to the future of German society, when every evening you're showing up in synagogue saying, God, please let me go back to Israel and rebuild that temple, right? And so German leaders recognized this and said, okay, we're going to slowly change these prayers. Again, we'll actually see this in a slide or two, but the early Reform movement was also against Zionism. And right, when we view it in this context, right, it makes a lot of sense why they were against Zionism, because Zionism was also seen as being disloyal, right? Obviously, after the growing anti-Semitism in the 1920s, 1930s, and of course the Holocaust, basically the entire Reformed Jewish community flipped on Zionism. And now the norm in a Reformed community is you assume that everybody is a Zionist by some standard. But you have this famous, I'm actually going to harness the power of the internet here and pull this up. So if you give me 20 seconds, I will pull up this interesting source, because I think it would actually be useful to see here. So one of the most famous delineations of the Reform movement, and so I will reshare my screen, is in the Pittsburgh Platform in, I think, 1885. And this is, again, after a lot of Jews are moving to America, and the Reform community is split in half, right? Half of it's still in Europe, and half of it is in America. And so Reform leaders decided, well, we should really write a series of guidelines as to what Reform Judaism really is. And so the Pittsburgh Platform, again, it's very short. This is it, but they basically talk about, right, the devaluation of ritual and a lot of things like that. And here is, of course, the most notorious. Let's find it. Here. So they say in number 5, we recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect, the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth and peace upon all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. And so the Reform movement in 1885 explicitly says, stop saying that Judaism is a peoplehood. Judaism is a religion, right? This would have been different than the way that the vast majority of Jews would have internally saw themselves. And now, of course, when we understand the historical and sociological pressures that were on the Reformed community here, this makes a lot of sense, right? This is the exact same thing as Napoleon's Sanhedrin, of basically saying, no, of course, we are loyal Germans or loyal Frenchmen or loyal Americans, and we're not part of this global national peoplehood, right? This was an attempt to hope on behalf of the Reformed Jewish community that if Judaism becomes a religion, that religion can easily assimilate into wider culture and be safe, right? Now, of course, the Reform movement updated its platform sometime in the 1930s and flipped on the Zionist issue and backtracked and said, you know, I'm paraphrasing here, just kidding, Judaism actually is a nation, and we do need to return to our national homeland in Palestine, because clearly this whole identifying as a religion thing didn't work out. And so today, right, if you go to an average Reform community and you ask, is Judaism a religion? The answer you'll get from most people is, that's part of it, but there's a lot more, right? At this time, there was a very conscious effort by Reform leaders to, again, try to make Judaism fit in as much as it can into the wider European population. And just here, the last thing that the Reform movement did was, again, start to question a lot of classic Jewish notions of dogmas. And this is, of course, still true today, where dogmatic ideas that are taken for granted in more traditional communities, right? The Reform community is much more open to intellectual inquiry in parallel lockstep with Enlightenment values. So this, of course, right, the last thing I did, I had one or two more things, right? They also became non-halachic, right? So this is, again, part of the Reform community in 2023, although the Reform community in 2023 is much more traditional in terms of ritual than the Reform community 150 years ago. One interesting example is at the same, in the American Jewish community, I believe during the Pittsburgh Platform in the late 1800s, they had famously what was called the treifa banquet, right? Treif is Yiddish for not kosher. And this is at one of the first ordinations for Hebrew Union College, so the Reform rabbinic program. And specifically after the ordination, all of the Reform leaders sat down and purposely ate all of the most non-kosher foods you can find, sending a message saying, these no longer have any relevance to us. Now today, if you poll Reform rabbis, I'm making up these statistics, so take it with a grain of salt, I would guess a pretty high percent keep some level of kosher, And so what I mean by that is would feel uncomfortable eating a pork cheeseburger, right? Whereas back then it was basically seen as this is part of Reform Judaism, right? To be Reform is to openly flaunt Jewish tradition. And so even getting to Marilyn's point before, right, that's one thing that I think is sociologically changing. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I'll talk more about this in 2 weeks, but today the pressure of keeping Jews Jewish is no longer that we need to make them, we don't need to make young Jews feel as if they are, can be both Jewish and American, and they're torn between these dualistic identities. Again, the problem today is apathy, and they don't feel that they're gaining anything from being a part of a Jewish community. And so 200 years ago, Jewish leaders and Reform leaders were making the argument of the way to ensure the survival of Judaism is to tell young Jews, yes, you can be Jewish and also adopt all of the cultural norms of the Enlightenment and Germany or France or America and all these things like that. Today, it's almost the opposite. Today, it's you actually are a part of a rich tradition that has commitments for you. It actually makes demands on your life, and commitments are a great way to find meaning. And so a lot of the sociological pressures has switched, which again, we'll talk about this more in 2 weeks. I obviously have a lot of thoughts here, but it's why I think for lack of a better term, the liberal Jewish community in America is switching more to obviously not a halachic in the same way as Orthodox, but switching to a more traditional and, reviving the power of ritual and all of these things. I mean, Abraham Geiger, just an interesting sociological glimpse. I mean, one of the more radical things that he said, I mean, he was against circumcision. He was against all of these things. I mean, he was really trying to push a message of none of the rituals of Judaism have any relevance for you. Just the last slide here before we lose people, so we can do this in the last 3 minutes. So this, of course, presents a big backlash. I probably won't tell anybody here anything they don't know in this slide, but obviously I have to mention it, right? So the Orthodox movement was also in Western Europe, in Germany, in the mid 1800s. And it was led by a guy named Moshe Schreiber, otherwise known as the Chatam Sofer. And this was, of course, a very traditional, both halachic and cultural. And so one of the things that the Chatam Sofer famously said is he went the exact opposite answer of Reform Judaism. Again, they were dealing with the same question, which is, how do you deal with this conflicted identity? So Reform says, try to adopt both. Orthodoxy says, you have to just go all in on Judaism. And if when young Jews leave the shtetl and start to assimilate, they have this torn identity, we're just not going to let them leave the shtetl and assimilate. And so, again, not only do you say, right, and the reason why a huge misconception, and so I just want to say this out loud, is that Orthodox Judaism was the norm and Reform Judaism obviously was the major historical switch. Right? Obviously, an Orthodox Jew might have been closer to the way that a Jew in the 1500s would have practiced, but Orthodox Judaism as a unique movement was equally a product of the Enlightenment, because for the last 3,000 years, and hopefully for people that have stuck with us for the last several months here, we've seen that part of Jewish evolution is remaining steadfast to tradition, but also being willing to adopt cultural norms and ideas and language and culture, right? For the last 3,000 years, Jewish community has been constantly this dialectic between tradition and modernity, right? This happened in Iraq and Iran, right? In Babylonia. This happened in Spain. This happened in modern Europe. For the first time in history, a Jewish community said, no more change, right? We're setting everything in stone, right? And that doesn't just mean you can't change Jewish law. It means culture. Right. So if you ask, why would Orthodox Jews in the year 2023 still dress like Polish noblemen in the 1800s? It's because of this idea of we don't allow anything to change. And so Orthodox Judaism took a snapshot of Judaism in the 1800s and froze it in time. And basically the argument went as this: if when Cindy goes out into the wider public, it's only a matter of time until Sydney somewhat assimilates, we're just not going to let her go out into the wider public. And that doesn't just mean Cindy has to keep the laws of kosher and Shabbat and all of those things. It means that we're not going to let Cindy listen to new music. We're not going to let you go to the university. We're not going to let you read any secular newspapers. better yet, why not just teach you only Yiddish so you could only consume our community's newspapers and things like that? And so Orthodox Judaism was a reactive or reactionary movement, right? It was not just the natural process of the way that Judaism existed, right? It obviously was extremely dogmatic. The Khatam Sofer had this famous line, Chadash Asor Min HaTorah, which is actually a pun. We don't have enough time to get into the pun, but it's a pun based off of a biblical verse about new grain, where there's a verse in the Talmud that says Chadash Asor Min HaTorah, which means new grain is forbidden from the Torah. And he took this to mean a catch-all cultural phrase where anything that's new is forbidden. And of course, Orthodox Judaism said no secular education, which again was a very new thing, right? Jews in Spain or Jews in Babylonia, or even if we go back thousands of years, Jews were always educated in the wider systems of what was going on, right? It was taken for granted by most leaders in Jewish history that you can have both, right? You can be a part of the flourishing Spanish Jewish community and be a part of the flourishing wider Spanish multicultural community and be a Jew and navigate both, right? Now, for the first time, you have a community saying, no secular education, right? We don't want to have any attachment to what's going on here. This obviously created reactionary movements, right? So one such reactionary movement is conservative Judaism, which arose that basically tried to, again, split the difference between orthodoxy and reform and say, yeah, those reformers went a little bit too far when they started to throw out the rules of kosher and Jewish law, but orthodoxy, right, that's just, way too traditional and conservative to me. Other reactionary movements was what's called neo or modern orthodoxy. Sidebar, this is the community that I grew up in, and the leaders of this community were, on the German side, it was Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and on the American side was Joseph Soloveitchik, and their catchphrase was Torah im derech eretz, right? So Torah with the way of the world. So again, attempting to go back to almost a pre-Enlightenment way that the Jewish community functioned of constantly trying to live this dialectic between tradition and modernity. And so the modern Orthodox community is halachic, but culturally modern, right? They don't look like 1800s Polish noblemen, but they will be keeping the laws of Shabbat and kosher and all of these things. And of course, right, going back to, I think, the way that Jewish tradition did function over the last many thousand years, stretched the secular education and sort of just from a cultural snippet, right? Yeshiva University in New York right now is probably the paradigm here, because to some extent, this is an oxymoron, because the yeshiva is a traditional Jewish study house and a university is a post-Enlightenment academic center. The fact that you're combining those two is just like modern orthodoxy, right? It takes two words that almost mean the opposite and try to fuse it. And so we end our snapshot, right? I think the last slide was just the conservative movement, which was a middle ground, right? This is, again, probably not news to anybody here, but we end today with, again, just, whoops, sorry, I meant to stop sharing, with just a brief overview of everything we did. So we focused a lot more on ideas today, but the 17th and 1800s for the Jewish community was a time of major sociological upheaval, and it quite literally paved the way to which most Jews think of Judaism today. And over the next few weeks, we'll talk about what happened with Zionism, which again was another outgrowth of this, and what happens once Jews, or at least a plurality of Jews, end up leaving Europe and starting to go to America. There were two major immigrations to America, right? One was 1881, and then the other was post-Holocaust. And so the American Jewish community, the European Jewish community is going to start to shift. And some of its influence end up going to the Middle East, to Israel, and some of its influence going to America, especially after the Holocaust. But virtually any, at least Ashkenazi Jew that you meet now, and again, it doesn't matter if they're ultra-Orthodox, Reform, secular, atheist, right, any of those things, this was probably one of the most important historical events and tidbits that informed how they practice Judaism today. So thank you all. This was a lot of fun, and we will talk next week. I'll probably end up doing Zionism next week because I think that's a fun topic. So I will see you all next Monday.